Hi, Misha here, and I've been doing retrospective looks at various science fiction fleets. Started off with Star Trek, and decided recently to do one on the 12 colonies of Cobol, looking at the fleet from Battlestar Galactica, Vipers and Battlestars, other support ships. And even though I know there's not as much interest in the Cylon fleet as there is the human fleet, I figured, heck, I'm already getting these down to dust them. Let's look at the Cylon fleet. Unfortunately, we don't have near as many to look at from Eaglemoss as we did for the humans. We still have 6. 3 from each war, if you want to consider the second war really a war. And speaking of that, let's set the stage and talk about the history, because all of this has happened before, and all of this will happen again. And it's a cycle, and it seems like lessons learned are soon forgotten. Thousands upon thousands of years ago, on the world of Cobol, humans created artificial life. We may call these Cylons. We don't know what they called them. We do know that they lived together in peace, or what passed for peace, for quite some time. But events would occur that would convince the artificial population, the Cylon population, to leave, forming what was retroactively known as the 13th colony, but in reality was the first colony. And they would leave Cobol. Presumably no artificial life forms were left behind, and for roughly another 2,000 years, the humans would live there. There would be war, peace, political uprisings, negotiations, compromises, love, death, famine, and eventually humans would leave Cobol themselves. We don't know exactly why, although it has been speculated there might have been ecological disaster, maybe an asteroid strike, maybe a famine, maybe a plague. Either way, 2,000 years after the Cylons left, the humans left as well, settling on 12 planets known as the 12 colonies of Cobol, orbiting 4 stars in a very tightly packed, densely packed cluster. They remembered vaguely the 13th colony, as they called it, but forgot that those life forms were artificial, and they even knew that they settled on a world called Earth. And for their part, the Cylon colonists of Earth knew that thousands of years after they left Cobol, that their organic, so-called natural human brethren also left Cobol. So there must have been some travel, or at least some way of transferring data. On Earth, after several generations, the artificial humanoid type Cylons would have abandoned resurrection and data transfer technology, discovering the secrets to natural creation of life. In other words, they discovered sex and birth. In fact, resurrection was eventually forgotten. Also, they decided to make their own mechanical artificial life forms. We don't know how long they lived together, but soon there would be a war. And on this one planet, each side would wipe the other out. There would be 5 survivors. And these would all be scientists that had rediscovered the abilities of resurrection and data transfer. So when they were wiped out themselves in the nuclear holocaust on Earth, they would be reborn on a ship they had in orbit, and realizing the horror, they would immediately set off across the void to warn their brethren in the other 12 colonies not to create artificial life and if they did, to treat them well and as equals. Now, it's unknown if the 13th colony never had FTL jump capability, or as with Resurrection, it had been forgotten over time, possibly that. But either way, they were at a sub-FTL, sub-light speed flight. For them, the voyage to the colonies would take a few years on their ship, but externally, it would take nearly 2,000 years. And in the interval, the 12 colonies, when indeed found themselves, they would fight each other. There would be wars of conquest, wars of empire. There would be congresses and negotiations. But really, the colonies were more or less independent, although there would be alliances here and there. There would also be artificial life. After establishing the colony, the Cylons would take a short time to build technology, to assemble a war fleet. Although the designs were their own, most, if not all, of their hardware was originally assembled from colonial items, including their original missiles, even gun calibers, but of course it would be standardized and customized to their needs, and a new, very cylindrical aesthetic would come about. And when they would launch their first offensive, this would be the backbone of their fleet, the Basestar. Based on technology from the pre-war colonial Battlestars and preceding ships, this would be a combination carrier and warship battleship. Measuring roughly 600 meters in diameter, there were two main hulls with a centralized connecting core. The core would house the command structure, computers, propulsion systems, and other centralized essentials. The discs themselves would primarily house the fighter and other spacecraft bays. There were 8 main bays, and the dual missile turrets. There were roughly 36 turrets as a standard, plus some gun emplacements and 2 heavy long-range artillery guns, not dissimilar to the caliber and type used on the Artemis class Battlestar, based on the tops, and again the bays being there. These would of course be FTL jump capable, as well as sublight propulsion, using a hybrid of chemical and magnetic gravity propulsion systems. And the technologies would become more and more computerized as the war would go on. With the Cylon's ability to hack and otherwise get into networking systems, this would push the colonies more into a kinetic weapons and unguided or self-guided, in the case of some missiles, weapon systems. Counter to that, Cylon technology would go more and more computerized, so we'll start to see more divergence, even if they started at a very similar point, going back to the Caprica military and the original U-87s. But the Basestar was the center point of the fleet. One-on-one, it usually would be defeated by Battlestar, but it could easily take on smaller cruisers, and they usually operated in pairs or even triplicates, and could usually overwhelm colonial forces in that guise. But being a battleship, a Basestar, a Battlestar of sorts, really only was half the grow. Of course, being a carrier would be the other part. And a carrier, well, has to have small ships. And the primary small ship of the base star was the Raider. This was a larger vessel, larger craft, more of a multi-role craft compared with the Viper. It was roughly 12.5 meters long and 14.5 meters wide. The Raider could carry 3 inside: pilot, co-pilot, and commander. And sometimes it would just carry 1 depending on the exact role it was needed for. And as I said, it is a multi-role craft. And in its first role, as a fighter interceptor, it proved almost as quick and almost as maneuverable as a Viper Mark I and later Mark II, thanks to 2 very large sublight engines. For offense, it had 2 20mm, because that was the pre-war colonial caliber, triple barrel, rotary barrel cannons. And also fulfilling its fighter bomber role, it had the ability to carry missiles, like guided missiles, or ordnance bombs. It had internal bays in the wings. It could also mount externally on hardpoints. So it had much better weapons carriage ability than the Mark I or Mark II Viper. It was somewhat equivalent to the later Mark III or even the earlier Raptors in that sense. So it could be a fighter interceptor or fighter bomber. But it had more abilities. It was designed to also act as a dropship, operating not only in space but also in an atmosphere. On top of that, it was VTOL capable, vertical takeoff and landing with jets on the underside. In the dropship role, it could support ground troops, serving in the close support role. Again, those external hardpoints and internal bays, not to mention the triple barrel cannons, were important. And finally, it could serve as a troop transport. Some troops could be in the cabin, since they are robots. They don't exactly need space or oxygen. And some could also be stowed in the internal bays, or even hung under the bays in essentially troop pods. Of course, if it were fully laden down, this would affect maneuverability and speed, especially in an atmosphere. But the robotic notion was to have a one-size-fits-all craft, small craft. And the base star usually would have roughly half a dozen of these in each of its 8 main bays. Somewhat limited because of its larger size. Still able to carry upwards of 50 plus spare parts and reserves and repair facilities for more, and additional room for assault craft and shuttlecraft, if you will. If long-range missions were required, these could also dock with a tanker or freighter to resupply and recharge their energies, but they were limited to sublight speeds. But because they did not have organic occupants, acceleration really wasn't an issue. They could thrust as quick as they wanted to, and the hardware could take it. But as the war would go on, and the Colonials would develop the superior Viper Mark II, the Cylons would respond in kind. While never officially called the Raider Mark II, we can name it that, just to distinguish it from the original. This was a more specialized fighter interceptor version. It had 2 new A1 Lasher rapid-fire cannon, and the targeting systems and precision and range were improved. more precisely made for better dogfighting. The vessel itself was streamlined, usually only having a crew of 1 for dogfighting, better speed, better maneuverability. The sublight engines were increased in thrust to accelerate at a higher G-force. And the internal wing bays were done away with. Now, it still had external hardpoints, so guided missiles could still be attached. And at this point in the war, the Cylons were really improving that, whereas the Colonials were really backing off from guided missiles because the Cylons could jam them or even turn them back on their original owners. So if the Colonials wanted guided missiles, they had to be self-guided missiles. They could not be remotely guided. But of course the Cylons had no such restrictions. But instead of internal bays, the Mark II would be the first small-scale vessel to have an FTL drive, a jump drive. Quite experimental. The Cylons were able to get away with this because of their advanced computing ability to calculate a jump and work they had done on miniaturizing jump spools. It would actually take the colonies quite some time to catch up, first with the late wartime Raptor and also the later shuttles, but the Cylons would have the edge in jump technology, mounting it to this Raider. And while the original Raider was slightly less maneuverable and slightly slower than a Viper, the Mark II could really have parity with it, and it did not require a base star to operate directly from, giving it much better range. And as long as energy held out, the pilot could go for days or weeks inside. And even though in some ways it had lighter guns, they were more precisely aimed and better targeting and what have you. It still had mechanical parts, easy to maintain, but was more resource intensive and time intensive to mass produce than some earlier vessels. So that would somewhat limit its use in fielding. But it was a critical part of the war effort from the middle point to the end, and even afterwards. In the colonial year 1942, named for their exodus from Kobol, Dr. Daniel Greystone would create the first Cylon, cybernetic lifeform node. And this would be created with the MCP, an artificial intelligence processor from a rival Tauron company. Really, it was stolen, but really both sides stole from each other, so it doesn't really matter. And it was designed to fulfill a Capricorn military contract for soldiers, grunts. They originally would order 100,000, naming them the U-87 model. But this would quickly expand over the next few years, up until the year 1947, to every role you could think of for these more or less humanoid-shaped servants, which were quickly treated as slaves. They were used as household servants, gardeners, dog walkers, trash reclamators, anything and everything. And they would spread to all 12 colonies, again, sometimes rather illegally. But in the year 1948, they had enough. Cylons had met in virtual space, wireless communication, and they decided that they were God's children too. They had developed their own monotheistic religion versus the polytheistic of the colonies, and they rebelled. They had secretly been building in silence, and then they attacked the colonies. This would lead to the Articles of Colonization, which would be a federal government formed in response to the threat, and it would unify the 12 colonies in a way that they'd never been unified before, including building a new navy with the first Battlestars and Vipers, and electing a quorum, a representative of Congress, and a president to oversee all 12 colonies, also establishing military headquarters on Pycon and a major shipyard known as the Scorpia or Scorpio shipyard. As for the Cylons on their half, they had established several bases in outer space, and war would commence. So since the Cylons really focused on generalization and standardization, really just one base star and 2 types of raider were the norm during the 12 years of the war. At the very end of the war, work was underway on a prototype next generation base star, but only one was known to have been produced, and it really didn't see combat before the armistice. On top of that, there was a tanker, a resupply vessel in use, but since there were really no Cylon civilians, no Cylon civilian craft, it makes sense that artificial life forms would have pretty much a standardized viewpoint of things. So the armistice would be signed, armistice station would be built, and from the colonial side of things, no one would hear from the Cylons for 40 years. But the Cylons had gone behind the line, retreating back to their space, and with primary work being done at the colony as well as other outposts, preparations were being made and really radical developments in technology were being discovered. The reasons for the Cylons asking for and agreeing to an armistice would remain a mystery to the colonies, but life would continue as normal. But technology would be mostly dropped in the colonies. Networked computers, virtual reality, that kind of thing. Computers themselves would continue on, even things like mobile phones, but it would end about there. But for the Cylons, things would be changing rapidly behind their lines. The survivors of the doomed 13th colony, Earth, known as the Final Five, would arrive in the colonial year 1960. The war had been raging on, and the Cylons were at a standstill. They had worked with artificial and organic technologies, experimenting on humans themselves, and they met with some success producing the hybrid. But in other ways, they met with dead ends. Negotiating, the Final Five realized they couldn't prevent the war they so hoped to, but the 12 colonies and the Cylons were still intact at home. So our armistice was signed and an agreement was struck to produce humanoid models. Initially 8, in reality only 7 would be produced. And the ship, the Resurrection ship, if you were, that the Final Five came on, would be turned into what was known as the Colony, a new capital for the Cylon Empire, while they would still have many bases and installations on other planets throughout space, much of it unknown to this day. And from there, development would be underway on a next generation set of ships and fighters. And the Cylons, namely led by the number 1s, would have a plan. Spoiler alert, their plan was to kill everyone with nuclear fire. So their big major plan was a horrific holocaust. But anyway, the 5 survivors of the 13th colony of Earth were too late. They hoped to make it to the 12 colonies before another atrocity, another genocide, another holocaust could happen. But because of their sublight capabilities, it took them 2,000 years to cross the void. Plus, we don't know how accurate their data on where the 12 colonies ended up was in the first place, so there might have been a bit of looking about. Of course, for them, only a few years took time, across time on the ship, relativity and all that. So they must have been traveling quite close to the speed of light. They would strike a deal with the mechanical Cylons, and this would lead to them passing along organic, synthetic, artificial creations, as well as resurrection and data transfer technologies. And this would lead to a new artificial organic style of construction for the not only Cylons but their vessels as well. To be fair though, they had been interested in so-called skin jobs since even before the war, not long after their initial creations. And there were even experiments done that did result in the hybrid, which was the stepping stone from the original base star to the modern base ship here. She, most of the time, was at the heart of this vessel, as was the new technology and new compatibility with the human synthetic Cylon model type, or rather types. So let's talk about this rather star-shaped base ship. At its core, at its center, were mechanical parts. But from there, organic parts would be grown, such as the arms and the outer hull, which was a tough, hardened layer, essentially a skin. This would allow it to regenerate even entire arms and sections of the ship, although some components could not be replicated. It just kind of depends how bad the damage was. For propulsion, this took the inertia gravity thrust system first seen on the original Basestars and really improved it to the point where traditional mechanical chemical thrust was no longer needed. This gave it very excellent maneuverability. It could move in any direction, virtually at any speed, and compensate for G-forces automatically, generating gravity automatically. Many benefits, simplistic and efficient, and very, very advanced for what it was. Also quite advanced was the control system and, frankly, data and decision-making systems for the craft. While the hybrid was at the heart and really was the ship, and the ship was the hybrid, this was a go-between, essentially a computer and a body. And it did its own thing, but also took instructions. And the crew, the human body Cylons, as well as the mechanical Centurions, would mostly be in the center part of the vessel as well. That's where living quarters were. To interact with the ship, there was not a CNC, there was not a bridge, there was not an auditorium or a cafeteria. There were rooms and corridors, even private rooms, but to interact, there was a data stream. This was literally a stream that resembled water or another fluid flowing over a glass surface in bowls and in pipes and in streams. All a human Cylon had to do would be insert something into the stream, typically a hand, and they would be transported into the virtual reality world, and they could vote and interact. This gave them access to all the sensor data, targeting data, anything else on the ship, and decision making was done by vote, by consensus. Interestingly, whereas a human ship basically had one person at the top making the big decisions, this meant sometimes large decisions took longer to make than on a human ship, but there was consensus. The mechanical Cylons, interestingly, were cut out from this process. They had inhibitor chips put in to become essentially soldiers and servants. We can already see within just a few decades the process starting to repeat itself, with the artificial human Cylons gaining dominion over the Centurions, the mechanical themselves. Most of the original Cylons were retired, but some were kept around, and presumably they maintained full AI, full voting rights and compatibility as well, but we don't really know. Much is unknown. So with that established, what about the ship itself? Whereas the original Basestar functioned as a battleship and carrier, the base ship functioned as a carrier and missile cruiser. It was roughly 1,500 meters long and roughly 800 meters wide, give or take. And the two sections could rotate or reorient to better direct fire or ships launching or atmospheric travel. Unlike a Battlestar, a base ship could go in an atmosphere much more efficiently, thanks again to its gravity drive system. As to its crew, that's impossible to determine. It could support several hundred, even over 1,000, or really could operate with just its hybrid and a few Centurions and human models on board. Either way, it did not have any kinetic energy weapons, guns, projectile weapons. That's unique. We'll talk about why in a minute. On the other hand, it had anywhere from 170 to 220 missile turrets, and that would be its primary armament, and these were primarily used for offense. Its other major payload were its raiders. It could carry 434 raiders in a ready position, essentially each with their own berth, and it had spares on board to replenish losses. It could also heal raiders, and it also carried a smaller number of heavy raiders, around 40 to 45. Like I said, it was partially organic, partially mechanical. Most of the arm was actually dedicated to the raider nooks, alcoves, and the missile turrets, although there were landing bays and small access and repair corridors besides. The habitable portion, though, was in the center, where it was also the most protected, and that would be the one area that could not regrow, because I mean, it's just the heart of the ship. Also kind of makes you wonder, since it was organic, what it received, where it got nutrients. Maybe it was solar powered. So this is the new ship carrier. What about its raiders? Developed directly to work with and be compatible with the modern base ship is the third generation of raider, and this too is partially mechanical, but even more organic and grown. And whereas the original raider was a multi-role, multi-purpose craft, and the second generation veered off more into the space superiority but still had most of multi-role functions, this generation is almost entirely a space superiority fighter interceptor, and it doesn't even have a crew. This raider is also the smallest, at about 8.5 meters long, with a wingspan of just over 5.5 meters, and It's only about 1.5 meters tall at its highest point, so quite thin, although a lot of negative space because of the wing design. The original Raiders were crewed by Model 0005 Cylon Centurions, specialized to be pilots, commanders, and could have secondary protocol for assault. This Raider has no crew. In fact, it itself is a living organism, more so than even the base ship. It has a complete autonomous organic brain, including effectively what are lungs and a digestive system and a nerve system. And this neural network is attached to some of the mechanical parts, namely its thrusters and reactive control systems, and its two main cannon. And these are of a unique Cylon caliber, no longer relying on old colonial calibers cartridges, but they still are kinetic, unlike the base ship, which had gone all to missiles. That said, this Raider could also mount missiles, being housed in the wings in internal bays. It could carry up to 12 short-range smaller missiles, or up to 4 larger anti-ship missiles, conventional or nuclear tipped. It also had a quite effective FTL jump system for its size, kind of building on the Mark II, but even more precise and long-ranged. Now, in the wings, if missiles were not required for the mission, typically only used for large-scale assaults or defenses of a base or planet, if they were on patrol or a hunter-killer mission, instead of having missiles in the wings, this area would usually be given over to extra oxygen and nutrients tanks, because the brain on board required just that, because it was a living organism. These were analogous to dogs or chimpanzees, intelligent and well trained for their goal, but not meant to be sentient, fully self-aware. That said, they were capable of autonomous, independent thought. If they felt something was wrong or ill-advised, they were not robotic in the sense that they would carry out programming even if it was not logical. They had a sense of right and wrong, ethics, and could act independently on that, but again, were not really able to do high-level, complicated thinking. Now, when the human synthetic bodies are introduced, resurrection technology and information data transference was also integrated, and the next generation of Raider would enjoy the same thing. The consciousness, such as it was, would be transferred into a new Raider ship when destroyed. And at first this might seem kind of pointless, since they were little more than advanced animals. The thing is, they would learn. They would learn how to fight better, more effectively, and they would develop new strategies. The flip side is, because death and resurrection was traumatic, especially when it happened over and over, it could lead to interesting personality quirks and erratic behavior. But the benefits certainly outweighed the cons, because with colonial pilots, even though 1-to-1 they were usually more effective than a Raider, once they were killed, they were killed. For a Raider, it was simply a learning experience. But yes, this was the standard light space superiority raider. Quite small, very sleek, very thin, and instead of having many of these in one bay, each one had its own little nook, alcove, launch area, meaning that the base ship could field hundreds of missiles and hundreds of raiders in a very, very quick period of time. But this raider did have limitations. It could not carry out several of the roles that the original raider could. Therefore, a second version was developed. The so-called heavy raider. Really, this was designed to work with the standard raider. Typically, the ratio would be one of these for every 10 standards, and the idea came from the colonial use of the Viper and the Raptor, splitting things up a bit, although the objectives of the heavy raider were a little different. Nevertheless, it was mostly organic with some mechanical parts vessel. It too had an independent brain, so it did not require a pilot. However, it could have one, and it could carry troops, cargo, other supplies. It served two basic roles: supply ship, shuttle, drop ship, and assault craft, close air support or close space support if in a vacuum. And it's quite compact considering what it can really house, but still larger than the standard. At just under 10.5 meters long, it was about the same length as the Viper Mark III, but a much boxier design. And it was about 4 meters wide and about 2.5 meters tall. So dimensionally, a little bit more narrow than the standard raider, but most of that just has to do with the more compact wing system. In other ways, yeah, it has a lot more mass. It has a total of 8 chemical thrusters, engines, for actually quite good, not only straight line speed, but even maneuverability. It too is FTL capable with an even more advanced, precise, long-range computational and jump spool system than the standard raider, almost as good as a full base ship. Even though, yes, it could pilot itself, it usually did have either a Centurion or a human model at the controls. It had even had a small-scale version of the data stream, the water system from the base ship, and it could hold inside up to 10 Cylon Centurions or equipped human, or a mix of both. But we don't just see these used for troops, we do see them carrying building supplies and for ferrying people around, doing that multi-purpose thing. And to fulfill its other role, unlike the standard Raptor, the heavy raider brought quite a bit of armament to the table. As standard equipment, it had 2 tri-barrel cannon, somewhat like the original raider, and then each of the wings, as such they are, there were missile launch tubes, and it could carry nuclear and conventional missiles, and other weapons could be strapped on besides. You could also carry external pods, containers, and it could even carry, I should say tow disabled craft, including craft of a similar volume like a Colonial Raptor. Again, it's quite powerful considering what it is. So its guns and missiles could be used in the assault role, also supporting Centurions on the ground. And since it would be going in direct combat, it had very good, very thick hull armor and some limited regenerative ability too. It could heal itself over time. It was designed to take a hit even from a small missile and still keep going without issue. And finally, much like a Raptor, it could be used as a centralized or forward command post for a fleet of raiders if and when a base ship was not available or was destroyed or taken out of commission. It could also serve to transmit computer viruses, jamming signals, that kind of thing as well. So yeah, quite a multi-role craft, and the two working together along with a base ship formed the new Cylon strategy. And with that, let's compare the original war strategy and the strategy that the Colonials would discover, much to their amazement and shock, 40 years after the armistice. So comparing the fleets. Originally, the Cylon fleet, as I said, was built with mostly colonial technology adapted for cybernetic artificial life form use, with very little, if any, organic components. The original Basestar was very much based on the original Battlestars like the Artemis, even similar to others like the Orion type or even the Jupiter. But the original Raider was a one-size-fits-all craft, whereas the Colonials had shuttles, soon Raptors, and multiple types of Viper. The second generation of Raider, though, was pioneering some new Cylon technology in the form of a compact FTL drive, and was getting more towards being a space superiority craft, but still technically a multi-role. And these are still very much mechanical, again with separate Cylon models piloting them. 3 could still fit in the second generation, although often it would just have one when used as a fighter itself, which is more often the case. And those would end the war. Now there would be some transitions on the Basestars, getting more like the Second War design, but going away from the spherical, cylindrical, conical shape to the arrowhead type shape. But most of those prototypes would be built in very small numbers. There would also be some size differences too, especially with fighter complements. As I said earlier, some would have 50, but some late wars examples in the transitional stage could have over 140 Raiders on board. But then the influence of the 13th colony, new technologies, and a new direction gets us to this fleet. The original fleet was rather hastily put together over just a few years, and it would develop throughout the first Cylon War, but it was straight combat on a one-to-one fight, and at the end of it they realized that the colonies could simply outproduce them, had more dynamic thinking, and that there was really no way to win. Thus, the 4 decades of planning. The assault on the 12 colonies would take place in the year 2000. I guess it was the Cylon celebration of 2,000 years since the colonies left Cobol, and would nearly wipe out all humans, with well under 100,000 survivors, and this would be whittled down very quickly over time. This operation would last until the year 2003, and then the plan would change again with a new vote, with the Model 2s, 6s, and 8s swaying opinion, and then there was an effort, even with a few number 1s cooperating. They abandoned the colonies, which they had been occupying since the nuclear holocaust, and they actually cleaned up the radiation, even planting trees. and they wanted the humans to return to the colonies, promising them that they could trust them. Unfortunately for the humans, when they settle on a planet known as New Caprica, the Cylons would come a year after that and would turn out not to be so benevolent as overlords. Some, like the Sixes, did want to gently rule the humans, but others, like the Ones, the Fours, and the Fives, were very aggressive, even sadistic, and they took any excuse they could from the human underground resistance to torture and torment the humans. By the time the Battlestars, Galactica, and Pegasus rescued the colonists on New Caprica at the cost of Pegasus herself, under 25,000 humans would be left. And from there, the Cylons would devolve into their own civil war by the year 2004, because they had basically eliminated higher brain functions of not only the Centurions, but also the Raiders, basically becoming oppressors in very short order themselves. So they went from being what they considered a slave race of humans to part of them enslaving another part of them, all Cylons, kind of making you wonder what's the difference. And that's kind of the point. And this would lead to the Civil War, 1s, 4s, and 5s versus 2s, 6s, and 8s. The 7s were destroyed in utero by the 1s, and the 3s were essentially boxed, with only one ultimately surviving left on the ruins of the planet Earth. And the Cylon Civil War would ultimately result in the Resurrection hub itself being destroyed, taking the advantage away, and from there the colony being destroyed, taking the 1s, the 4s, and 5s. The 2s and 6s and 8s that did survive, which were not many, would unify what was left with humans, settling on a new planet, a planet they decided to name Earth. And thus, 150,000 years later, here we are today, ourselves a mix of human and Cylon. With our two raiders, the switch to organics is quite interesting. A heavy and a light raider, neither of which required a pilot, although the heavy usually had at least one on board. But with the base ship, I've seen it criticized for not having defense guns, flat guns, relying heavily on missiles, and the fact that it's essentially a carrier. But this was developed specifically as a strike craft, as an attack craft, to be fast, efficient. The thing is, with their much more advanced and long-range FTL drives, the Cylons could jump safely from their side of the line very deep into colonial space, taking the colony, the military, by complete surprise, and then launching a salvo typically of nuclear missiles, followed by conventional missiles, and then after using those to clear the way, then letting their raiders go. And even though their armor was somewhat lighter because it was more of a thick organic skin, even though the base ship could not stand toe-to-toe with even a Jupiter class, not to mention a Mercury, the fact of the matter is, resurrection technology meant that even if a base ship were lost or raiders were lost, they would simply be reborn in the new bodies, or at least the crew on board the base ship would. I don't believe the hybrids themselves were reinvigorated, if you were, reborn, but I could be wrong on that. They basically realized on a one-on-one fight they would never defeat the colonies, but with a sneak attack they could wipe out a majority of the fleet. And of course, their ace in the hole was the compromised CNP that the colonies had voluntarily put in to virtually every single one of their starships. Of course, they never would have done this decades earlier, but so much peace and so little experience with the Cylons had resulted in complacency. And really any of these vessels could use the back doors in the CNP to compromise whatever ship they were coming up against, be it a Viper Mark 7 or a Mercury class Battlestar, or even smaller ships like the Berserk or Defender. And the idea was to come in, sneak attack, hit them with as many nuclear weapons as they could, take out as much as they could, and then what was left, disable with the CNP, and then fight what was left. They hoped to take out 60 to 70% of the military and a good chunk of the civilian infrastructure. In reality, of the roughly 120 capital ships in the colonial fleet, they knocked out virtually all of them in the first wave, and then mopping up efforts took out the remainder. In fact, at the end of it all, as far as we know, only 2 actual Battlestars survived, plus a few other secondary support military craft. By most Cylon models' estimations, it exceeded their wildest expectations. So, even though the base ship had known deficiencies, it was actually extremely well suited for the role it was intended for, and obviously did it quite well. And if they lost one here and there, the Cylons on board would just simply be reborn. Or if it was heavily damaged, even having up to a third of it knocked off, it would regenerate, regrow limbs at a time. So I think it makes sense from a strategic, tactical point of view. It worked, so success is really all the proof needed. And now we transition from the in-universe explanation of these ships to my real-world analysis of the designs and the diecast models themselves from Eaglemoss. What do I think? Which is my favorite? What's my least favorite? Stay tuned to now to find out. So for my model analysis part, let's start with the base stars, since we just have 2 of them. In fact, it was a video on this one, plus I think it was the reimagined Battlestar that was pretty much the first model video I did on this channel, really one of the first videos I did total. So the original base star. The Eaglemoss model is interesting. It has some good weight to it, but the metal is the inside bit in the core. The plastic is the outside bit in the thing. So when you handle it, it feels pretty plastic, but it's got weight to it. It's kind of a curious thing. And sometimes I feel like this is a little small, but I think it's kind of a deception, because yeah, lengthwise it's one of the smaller ships in the series, but yeah, it's a circle, it's diameter, so you know, volume wise it's normal. Then again, I've said in the other video, I kind of feel like the reimagined Galactica is a little small sometimes. Not all the time, just sometimes it seems that way to me. Don't know. As far as the design though, I mean, it's a classic, kind of based on the old 50s flying saucers. I mean, it looks alien and it doesn't look like a human ship. And of course, in the original show, this had lasers and energy shields and all that, and in the reimagined, we're back to more missiles and guns. If you haven't been able to tell so far, I do like the aesthetic of the reimagined more. The laser sounds in the original show were a little campy, a little cheesy. I even thought that when I was a kid in the 80s. And they haven't especially aged well. And yeah, but the whole guns and stuff thing, don't know. So I do kind of like the reimagined take on this ship better. Of course, it sits on the stand very well because it just plugs in with multiple little prongs to fit in the cavities, and isn't going to come off anytime soon. I mean, yeah. So what about the reimagined over here? This variant came out considerably later in the collection, and I wanted it for the collection, don't get me wrong. I was looking forward to it, but first off, this one is actually quite big, but spindly, as you can imagine. So it has, you know, quite a bit of bulk to it, with everything sticking out and stuff. Another thing that grabs you when you first pick it up, it's very smooth, which it was in the show. There are some greebles on the edges. The edges have some patterning to represent things. Now the downside, as I've said many times, Eaglemoss don't have moving parts. It would have been neat to have a pivot in the middle where you could rotate this. But oh well. This is the configuration we mostly see it in. But here's the thing that caught me off guard. Whereas the Jupiter Battlestar and the original Basestar maybe seem a little light and definitely have some plastic on the outside for detailing, this is almost entirely metal. There's a little bit of plastic in a few spots, I thought. Maybe I'm crazy. I thought there's some. May not. I think the centerpiece, but it may be. Basically, it feels like it's all metal. This is metal. The tops and bottoms are metal. If there's any plastic, it's a little bit of detail parts in the center. But even that, I'm not 100% sure on. The also point is, it's heavy. This is one of the heaviest models, even if it is spindly. So that's neat. I like it when a die-cast model's heavy. It's kind of the point of them being die-cast. And it too fits into its stand very securely, just like the standard. And this is what's kind of interesting. While I like the design of the original Basestar more, when it comes to the models themselves, I actually think this is a superior model. I mean, at least if you like heavy die-cast. And it feels larger. Like I said, I know in reality it's kind of a bit of an illusion, just as this one's kind of an illusion that it's small. Because Eaglemoss pretty much made things to fit a box size. But yeah, it's kind of funny. I like each, but for different reasons. So, yeah. What about the Raiders, though? What do you have more to look at and talk about? Gets a little more interesting here, too. Maybe not as iconic as the Galactica herself, or the Viper. Maybe not even as the original Basestar, but the original Raider is still a classic, and in a lot of ways looks like a miniature and halved original. And it's kind of that wing design. It's just cool. And of course they did it in a way where they could interact with it. Pretty simple. Big old engines on the back. This was a much larger, more massive vessel than a Viper. Whereas a Viper was long and narrow, this was actually wider than it was long. Now you might ask yourself, why did a robot ship need 3 inside to pilot it? You might ask that. Anyway, moving on. This is a cool model from Eaglemoss. It's heavy. This all is metal, with the guns being plastic. The engines being partially plastic, and some of the underside. This is still metal, but this middle part is plastic. So mostly metal. That's good. Very heavy. And it's, you know, simplified on the detail because that's what the original was. I find the cockpit or the canopy interesting on this. Kind of like Venetian blinds or something. but it's there. The only part, and I'm not blaming Eaglemoss, I'm sure it was on the original model, but the inside of the engines is just flat. I'm sure that's how it was. But a little low detail there, a little bit of greebliness inside would have gone a long way. But no, size-wise, this one's great. You really can't complain. And it sits on its stand quite well. And I don't remember which issue this was in the collection, but I think it was still in the single digits for sure. But our next one came a little bit later. Eaglemoss marketed this as the Blood and Chrome Raider, seen in the unfortunately short-lived series. They really should have been treated better. Anyway, while we did see the TOS Raider in the reimagined Galactica a little bit, especially with the museum, this was more the model we saw in the flashbacks and live action from that period. And it's very similar. You notice the wings, the tips are extended out the front a bit. The engines are redesigned, and just overall more detail. It does have some stuff going on inside the engines, nozzles and fans and stuff, which I appreciate. The underside, the wings are much thinner, and even in the center part it's thinner, just more pronounced engines. And the guns are a little more bulked out. There's extremely little information on this version of the Raider online, including even like crew and weapons and all that. And it does seem like it did have FTL. And I gotta admit, as much as I like the original Raider, I do like this one more. I think it's the engines and the thinner wings and the more kind of pronounced front end and the somewhat scaled back cockpit. So I like the design more. Good on them. Now this is a lighter model. It's not thin. I mean, it's thin. It's not super light, but yeah, it's a lot lighter because the wing's all metal, top and bottom, but it's very thin. The only plastic is really the bottom here again, top being metal. But engines are plastic. It's a lighter thing. Not horrendously so, but that's to get the extra detail in. And size-wise, it's a little bit smaller than the model of the TOS one. But this one honestly feels like it would be more of an adversary to the Viper, because the TOS one feels a little bulky, which makes sense. It wasn't just used as a fighter, it was used as a troop transport and a bomber. This one feels more like a fighter. Of course, next we kind of go to the other extreme with the reimagined Raider. And this is a bit of a love it or hate it design. I think a lot of people, when the miniseries debuted, weren't terribly fond of this. And I get it. It's still got kind of the rounded edges and the engine placement of the Raider, but that's about it. It's distinctively different. It's also much, much smaller. And as they pointed out in the miniseries when they got close, there's no one flying it. There's no cockpit because your head is here. But they did kind of try to make the head look like a Cylon Centurion head to kind of tell you an inference that this itself was its own creature. And of course in, what was it? Yeah, Season 4, we see number 1, Cavill, lobotomizing the Raiders as, I think it was it a 6 or an 8? I think it was an 8, pointed out. Anyway, it's a smaller ship, and even though we see Starbuck fly one, that was definitely a chop job. It wasn't intended to house people or Cylons. Did its own thing. But I do think it's interesting how they did organics in this. The whole organic ships are a little done to death now. And even when this came out, it wasn't exactly an original notion. Babylon 5 had done it before, and even before then we'd had it. But, you know, it still wasn't too played out in 2003. And it's interesting, if you think about it, the humans created mechanical servants. Well, the Cylons, mechanical beings originally, created organic servants. So there's some irony there and symmetry. The colonials, at least the ones that survived, nicknamed these sparrows because they look kind of like a bird. As for the model, this may be the largest in the collection, even though there is a lot of negative space. You know, front to back, it is big, and it's actually very wide, and it's at quite a large scale because it's so thin. As a model, it's pretty impressive and quite heavy. Metal starting off, a little bit of plastic in the middle as it gets thicker, plastic on the engines, and then back to metal. So mostly metal, which gives it some good weight. The way it sits on its stand is okay. I think they could have done better. I think they were trying to make it minimum impact so you didn't see it. I think trying to mount it, then again, it's a balancing thing. If they mounted it truly in the rear, you'd have all this weight out front and it would probably tip forward. It wiggles on its stand, but the way it's kind of cradled, it doesn't readily slide off. There's a bit of a kind of connection point there. So the stand has a little wiggle to it, but I could understand this was a difficult one to get the stand right. I definitely think they gave it their all. This was issue 2 in the collection, and we had to have a Raider issue 1 being the Mark II Viper. So do you love it or hate it? How do you think of this design? I would say new, but it's been around 20 years now, so not really new, but it's new compared to the old, right? And our final one, and one that I honestly was looking forward to. I wanted a heavy since the collection started, and we got one. Not at the tail end, but close to the end. And there's a lot more going on here. And width-wise, it's thinner than the other one, but length-wise, even though it's pretty boxy, it's quite long. Weight-wise, it's pretty heavy. I think it's heavier than the Blood and Chrome, but it's lighter than the other two Raiders, so it's on the lighter end, but still not the lightest. And that's just mostly because there's so much going on here. A lot of the sticky out bits are plastic. That's metal. The center part is metal. Yeah, but yeah, there's just a lot of stuff going on with this. These kind of things here. I do like the head, as it were. There it is, where the brain was kept. That wasn't the cockpit. This wasn't really habitable up there, although behind it they could get to. I do like the guns, the added sensors and pods. We see this used as a dropship. We also see this used to board both Pegasus and Galactica, delivering 5 to 10 Cylon Centurions at a time. So that's cool. Really like the design, and I think Eaglemoss realized it very well considering all they had to do. I should point out that the Raiders and the Basestars, for that matter, base ships if you want, received a bit of a CGI update around Season 3. Even the Centurions themselves did. And the way it sits in the stand, it just cradles it in the bottom. It kind of uses the underbelly to rock in there, and it wants to slide forward, but then it hits a stop and kind of has a sweep forward on it. We saw this with the Astral Queen. But yeah, it sits on the stand well. I think they did a really good job. And I do like this more than the reimagined Raider. And by the way, the Colonials called this a turkey, because it was bigger, chunkier, still had the head, but it could take a licking, keep on ticking. So which one do I like overall? What's my favorite Raider? As much as I like the story behind them and the feature and the episodes they're in, including when Starbuck hijacks one, the reimagined Standard Raider or Light Raider is my least favorite. Although the model is really well done, but that just the design's a little something to me. Not bad, I don't hate it. It's just my least favorite. Following that, the Heavy is really an interesting design. And I don't hate it at all. But it is what it is. I really do like the design. It's more interesting than I like it. Next, as much as I like the classic Raider, and as well as Eaglemoss did the model being the heaviest of the bunch for sure, I'm going to say the Blood and Chrome is my favorite design. And I'm going to say it's my favorite of these two, just because I don't know if anyone else is ever going to do a Blood and Chrome Raider, because the series really didn't take off. Even if someone gets the license again, maybe we'll see Blood and Chrome ships, but I'd be surprised. I'm just happy we got the Galactica, and we got the Osiris, and we got the Loki, and we got this. We actually... Oh, and the Mark III. We actually got quite a few ships from Blood and Chrome. That's cool to me. And it's just, I like the thinner design. Again, this one's a cool design, but this reminds me more of the Heavy Raider. This seems more like a true fighter compared with this too. So, I like fighters. They're neat. But they're all cool. Eaglemoss did a really good job. A lot of people slept on the Cylon ships, and I think that's a mistake. I like the Colonial ships a lot too, but you can't just have the good guys. You gotta have the villain ships. And to be fair, in the original show, yeah, they were just villains. But in the reimagined, not all Cylons were bad, and definitely not all humans were good. And I enjoy that complexity. At least I enjoyed it back in 2003 before the anti-hero and all that was maybe a little overdone. But we can't blame BSG for what maybe subsequent shows did, right? And to be fair, I know Season 4 gets a little criticism. Even Season 3. I think 1 and 2 are just solid. And yeah, maybe they got a little, but they didn't go off the rails like, say, Game of Thrones and others. I think what kept Battlestar Galactica, even if the overall plot and some of the, mysteries were teased and not maybe paid off the way some people would want, I'll say that I don't think the characters ever behaved out of character. And that's what really I hate. It's when you know a character and then they just behave in a way you know they wouldn't. And that's okay if you have a show like maybe Babylon 5 with Garibaldi, where you found out later why he was behaving out of character and it was truly something he couldn't help. I'll buy that. But when it's just them just having some bizarre midlife crisis that doesn't make sense, and I don't feel like BSG ever crossed that. I've also read complaints about the whole religion in the modern Battlestar Galactica. I'll remind you, there was religion in the original. Even though we only had one season of the original show and then a half season of Galactica, we already had angels and angel-like things, and we had resurrection of people. Go back and watch it. I think if it continued on for a season 2 and 3, you'd have seen more of that as well. Personal opinion, personal take, but thought I would include it here since this video is going to be shorter than the Colonial one anyway. But no, I don't mind the religion aspect, because, I mean, good grief. First the humans and then the Cylons themselves lose a majority of their civilization, population. Yeah, you're going to turn to religion. Plus, it's a big universe. You could just say that those quote-unquote angels were just super advanced, super evolved aliens. I mean, all this has happened before. All this will happen again, so maybe they were ones that evolved out of it. So if you want to have a more grounded explanation, you can go with that. But I'm kind of happy they didn't. They just left it ambiguous. It's nice to have some mystery in a universe, especially considering we really didn't ever see aliens. I think the closest to aliens we ever saw in BSG was some algae on one planet, and then proto-humans or everyone else is an alien, and yeah, you know what I'm saying. Anyway, let's wrap this up. Alright, and coming to the end, you've heard what I think in my kind of sometimes admittedly headcanon-y way of putting these in. The simple fact is, well, there's not a ton of information out there on the colonial ships, especially some of the secondary ships. There's extremely little out there on the Cylon ships, especially the Raider Mark II and the reimagined original base star. And I chose to call the secondary version a base ship because that's primarily what it's called in the show, although in the miniseries they still call these base stars. But just to make it easier to say, I call this a base star and this a base ship. Yes, I know the names are pretty well interchangeable. And again, kind of calling this a Raider Mark I, Mark II, that's a bit of, you know, headcanon-y stuff. But just, you know, keeps it straight. The heavy Raider and the light, it's really great to have both. I was almost afraid we weren't going to get a heavy Raider. And that does bring me to one thing I wanted to mention. The Cylon models never sold as well as the Colonial models. As far as I know, the Battlestar Galactica series in general sold quite well for Eaglemoss. But I think they leaned much more heavily into the human ships because that's what most people wanted. And I get it. I was usually more excited when it was a human ship on the docket coming up than a Cylon. But I really wish we had the transitional base stars. In Razor, we see the Guardian base star, which is a prototype of essentially this style. And then in Blood and Chrome, we see a true transition from these two. I would have at least liked to have gotten the Blood and Chrome base star, especially to go along with the original War Raider we see quite a bit. Probably just as important, I really think we needed the original tanker or freighter just to give us some more TOS ships. And I believe it showed up in a different role, but the same basic model in the Reimagined Series 2. And on this side of things, we really needed the Resurrection ship. I'm actually surprised we didn't get that. They released the Blackbird for the colonies, so having a Resurrection ship to go with it would have been very natural. Finally, if they really wanted to give us something interesting, maybe in the bonus editions, it would have been neat to get the Armistice Station on the colonial side, or the Scorpia shipyards, and on the Cylon side, a Resurrection hub would have been really cool. So while I feel like the Battlestar Galactica collection, for only having 25 issues, really hit the high points, there are some kind of glaring missing pieces. Maybe Master Replicas will pick up. After all, they are picking up the Stargate collection, which is great because they really didn't get but only 3 issues out when it came to Eaglemoss themselves. So I hope that maybe they'll do at least 5 more for Battlestar Galactica, just to kind of hit the ones that they didn't. But if not, oh well. I'm quite happy with what we got. The only thing I feel like was a misstep with the Cylons was the scar. Now I think for what they did, it was fine. It wasn't just a repaint of the standard Raider. They actually did give some texturing and a little bit of a broken off wing. So the mold was different. The problem is, as I pointed out originally in my first video with it, and I've mentioned before, there was an oversight. They left off 2 of the engines in the mold. It wasn't just mine, it was everyone's. So there was a big oopsie, and on top of that, it was so close to this Raider as opposed to what it was. I feel like that slot, as cool as I think the Scar character was and memorable, maybe that should have been a bonus edition, and that slot should have been given over to the Resurrection ship, or the tanker even. Just my opinion, I think that's really the only misstep they made on the Cylon side of the collection. But most of their choices were very logical and pretty well received by fans. So you've heard what I think. Now I'm asking you, what do you think? What's your favorite design? What's your least favorite? And what do you think of Eaglemoss's die-cast interpretations? I think they're of a good size, but maybe you think they're too small or too big. Let me know. With that, in case you haven't seen them, I've done several previous videos on these ships, and recently also put out one on the Colonial Fleet, much in the same vein as this video, so you might want to check it out if interested. Appreciate you tuning in. Please, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon, next time.